I never expected life to spiral into such chaos. For years we had what seemed like a perfect life, a stable home, happy kids, and a trusting relationship. Or so I thought, but things changed fast as cracks appeared in our marriage. I no longer recognized our life. It started small missed dinners, distant talks, and excuses that didn't make sense. I brushed it off thinking every marriage has rough spots, but soon I was questioning everything. Especially Richard. In the months before that fateful day, we were like strangers under the same roof. He came home late, and when we talked, it wasn't. Tried to hold on for the kids, hoping things would return to normal. Then the night I received those damning photos, my world fell apart. Everything I believed about my husband, our love, and our life shattered instantly. Every day followed the same disturbing routine. Just before school ended, the familiar old Volvo would park nearby, never too close. One day, a mother saw the driver peering through binoculars and called the police. As the kids poured out of school, is a whim get out of the caravan from 400 yards away. I recognized his frame, his stress. Gesture showed something to the police officer. Mommy, why are you crying? Thomas, are you hurt? No, sweetie, the wind just blew something into my eyes. Elide hugging the man walking to the car. I glanced back and saw him still talking to the officer. 2 days later, I had Penny pick up the kids within minutes. Richard approached them. The line spotted him first and ran to him, with Thomas following. He hugged them tightly, and I watched crying. He crouched to speak with them, then turned to Penny. I walked over to him. Hello, Richard, it's been a while. His eyes were filled with anger. That was your choice, not mine. What do you mean? I've never kept you from the kids. He pulled some papers from his jacket and handed them to me. What do you call this? I glanced at them and recognized only one phrase: restraining order. I don't understand. I never filed this. Well, someone did. Mommy, can Daddy come home with us? Melon asked, tugging on my arm. Richard shook his head gently. Not tonight, darling. As she turned to leave, he said over his shoulder, by the way, I'll deny this meeting ever happened. Richard, wait, can I have those papers? No, it's my only copy. I'll send it. Anonymous. Laya hugged and kissed the kids, then walked away. They called out to him but hadn't looked back. Whim wiping his eyes in the car. Penny stared at me in disbelief. Tell me you didn't do this, Kath. Richard's a good dad. I didn't, Penny, I replied firmly, but I'm going to find out who did all the way home. I couldn't stop thinking about his face, desperate, broken, and hurt. I tried to remind myself he deserved it. That had betrayed me by sleeping with another woman. Less than 7 years of marriage, and he couldn't stay faithful. What was wrong with me? I loved him and did everything to keep him. He's self in shape for him. I thought that was proud of me, but I was wrong. It had been nearly a year since those photos arrived. They left. To Richard's tear-streaked face, the whole situation wasn't fair. He'd lost access to the kids, while I got everything. Ate up as I prepared dinner, and Tony noticed. What's wrong? You seem down tonight. He asked. I just saw someone from my past. They're not doing well, and I keep wondering if there's anything I can do to help. Tony shrugged. The only person who can help you is yourself. Winners and losers, that's life. You're probably right. My worrying won't change anything, I replied, though doubt lingered in my mind. Later, as I sent the kids to brush their teeth before bed, Thomas shouted, I want Daddy to read me story. Tony folded his newspaper and walked toward them. But Maddie cried out, not you, we want a real daddy. Tony's tone hardened. Well, if your real daddy loved you, he'd be here, wouldn't the Tony? I yelled, rushing over as Maddie started crying. She looked up at me, eyes full of tears. Daddy does love us, doesn't he, Mommy? Of course he does, sweetie. He loves you more than anything. I don't know why. Tony said that. Maddie sniffled. He doesn't like Daddy. Tried to reassure her. I'm sure Tony loves you too. He's just upset right now. I don't like him. I want to see Daddy. I'm working on it, sweetie. Let's get you to bed and I'll figure out Daddy's visits after tucking them in. I went downstairs, still fuming. Don't you ever talk to my kids like that again. Tony gave me a hard look. Oh, they're your kids. I thought we agreed they'd be our kids when I moved in. Richard will always be their father. That won't change. Tony crossed his arms. Maybe I could have worded it better, but they need to know the truth. He's not part of their lives anymore. When's the last time they saw him? 3 months ago today. I said quietly. He was with them at school when I was late. Tony's expression shifted. Did you talk to him? No, he left before I arrived. Typical. What did you say? Tony's voice grew tense as him down. He didn't fight for anything. He got the house, the child support, the maintenance. He just gave in. Tony smirked. Would give us what we want or you'll never see your kids again. He had no choice. Then why isn't he using his visitation, if the kids mean so much to him? I don't know. I muttered, but I saw broken he was today. There's gotta be a reason. I didn't mention the restraining order, but a part of me suspected Tony knew more about you tit than Heliton. I quiet, waiting for the chance to read it myself. I checked my email again. Nothing from Richard. In desperation, I looked in the junk folder and found an attachment called injunction to message. Just the file. I printed it out and put it in my briefcase. Tony walked in with an overnight bag. Forgot to mention I have to go to Southampton tomorrow. I won't be back until Friday evening, just one night. You'll be back Friday, I asked. Yeah, for sure. How about we go out to dinner Friday night? I'll book a table, he offered, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms are. How about a little affection before I leave? Not a night, Tony. Not in the mood. I pulled away from him. He sighed. Is this still about what I said to Maddie? Yes, it is. I can't believe you'd heard that little girl's view of her father just because you're jealous. I thought you were better than that, jealous of him. Really? Tony scoffed. Why else would you react like that when she prefers her dad? I challenged. Of course she prefers him. He said, frustrated. He's been in her life forever. I've only been here 6 months. There was a pause. And then Tony softened. I'm sorry, Kathy, you're right. We just need more times. He'll come around, especially since he's not visiting. I don't want to talk about this anymore. I'm going to bed. Is Ed walking away? Meanwhile, Rob noticed something was off with Richard, who looked exhausted and kept dropping his tools. Okay, what did she do this time? Rob asked, eyeing him. I'm fine. Rob muttered, come on, I can't tell's up yesterday. You seemed like you were doing better. But now we're back to square one, Rob said, standing up and looking down at Richard as they worked on a car engine. Richard hesitated. She says she knows nothing about the restraining order, acted like she was confused when I showed it to her. You talk to her, you nuts. Your lawyer told you to stick to the order until it's lifted. Rob reminded him. Yeah, but they're not this kid's, Rob. I had to see them. Richard said, his voice is strained. Rob put a comforting arm around Richard's shoulders. Come on, let's uncall it tonight and grab a beer later. They sat in the kitchen, Richard with a beer, Rob with a coffee. So what happened today? Rob asked. I've been waiting outside the school for the past couple of weeks, just to catch a glimpse of Maddie and Tom. Richard admitted, careful, Richie, that could get you in trouble. Like, no, a couple, Rhea. Di checked on me, but understood he's divorced too. Richard said, stick to the story. What happened today? Kathy didn't show up. Her friend Penny picked up the kids. So I thought it was a good time to talk. You should have seen them, Rob. They were so happy to see him. I bet they were. How long has it been? Rob asked. Richard sighed. Too long, about 3 months. Anyway, while I was with them, Kathy showed up and acted like it was all my fault. I showed her the injunction and she claimed she didn't know about it. He looked me in the eyes and lied. If I hadn't seen her signature on it, might have belie. Vet her. How did she turn into this? The Kathy I knew wouldn't have done this, taken everything and kept me from my kids, did. I caused this Rob to done mistake, turn her into someone else. I doubt it was just you. That guy she's living with probably has a lot of doubt with it. So after I showed her the injunction, I left. Maddie wanted me to come home with them. As I walked away, Kathy asked for a copy of the injunction. Why would she do that if she already has one? I don't get it. Either. I thought you were solid. Never expected her to react like this. To one mistake. It was just one mistake. And I didn't even remember it anyway. I told her I'd email her a copy tonight, so I should go to that. Be careful, Richie, if that could count as contacting her. Don't worry, I'll set up a new Hotmail account and deny it. Richard headed to his room. Looking back, I can't pinpoint how I ended up living with Tony. There wasn't any great romance or falling in love. He was just always there. After the photos, I leaned on him for support and he helped me through the divorce. He took control, and I became dependent on him. He comforted me, took me out, and eventually we ended up in bed when he suggested moving, and it seemed like a good idea. I liked him. He was kin to me and the kids. I didn't feel passionate about him, but thought it could work. Now I was seeing a different side of Tony, cruel and vindictive. Richard would never have said such hurtful things to the kids. Tony was behind the injunction. It's how to side of him. I hadn't realized that night in bed. Tony tried to cuddle, but I pulled away, left. I'm going to Maddie's room. It needs sleeping in her room. I thought about the injunction. It included false claims that Richard had threatened me and Tony, and my signature was at the bottom. I knew I hadn't made those statements. I decided to seek legal help the next morning. Breakfast wastins. Tony wasn't happy about being left alone. Kids were upset with him, and I was exhausted. I was relieved to drop the kids at school and head to work at work. I reviewed their restraining order again. The statement attributed to me were complete lies. The order had been requested by my firm, Pendleton, Sims and Woodcock, on behalf of Tony, and by mid-morning, I knew I needed to confront Mr. Michael Pendleton, the senior partner. I went to his office and knocked on the door. Good morning. Kathleen, what can I do for you? Hesk, looking up from his desk. He'd help with the legal issue. As Ed handing him the injunction papers. This was served on my husband, but he never made the statements in here, yet my signature is on it. Mr. Pendleton furrowed his brow as sheer Ed through the document. You're making a serious allegation. Are you saying you never requested this injunction? That's exactly what I'm saying. I never asked for it, and the statements inside, you're denying those as well. I didn't make them. None of it is true. He looked at me, measuring his words. Then what do you need from me, Kathleen? I want the injunction overturned on my kids and see their father, and I want to know who's behind this. Mr. Pendleton leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. You do realize that if Tony is involved it could ruin his career. I didn't know that I confessed, but my children need their father. Tony falsified evidence, then he has to face the consequences. She nodded thoughtfully. I understand. I'll investigate and get back to you this afternoon later. Just as I was preparing to leave for the day, Mr. Pendleton called me back to his office. I quickly phoned Penny to ask if she could pick up the kids. What if Richard shows up? She's sounding worried. Let them talk to them. I reassured her, just don't let them take them. I'm working on editing. The order overturned, it doesn't apply to the kids, so it's fine. After hanging up, I headed to Mr. Pendleton's office. He rose to greet me when I entered, his demeanor more formal than usual, as if I were a client rather than a colleague. Kathleen, I'm glad you could come. I assume someone is handling the children's pickup. Yes, everything's taken care of. Thank you. Mr. Pendleton, I replied. He smiled slightly. You're always so organized. Please have a seat. As I sat down, I noticed the tension in the way he steepled his fingers, clearly deliberating over how to share what he had discovered. Kathleen, thank you for bringing this to me. If you had taken it elsewhere, it could have embarrassed the firm. As spoke with the court clerk, and while they usually require original documents, a photocopy of your statement was submitted for this injunction. The clerk suspects your signature was added through cut and paste. My heart sank, knowing what was coming. Dinda Trent requested the injunction, acting on instructions from Mr. Woodward, who was very forceful. Will handle Miss Trent appropriately. The injunction will be overturned tomorrow morning. Looked at me with sympathy. I'm sorry, Kathleen. This was all Anthony's doing. He used the firm's name without approval. He walked around his desk and sat on the edger. You okay? Do you want to sit for a bit or may behave some to nothing? Thank you, sir. I just need to get back to my children. I replied, holding myself steady. Please call me Michael, he said, gently guiding me toward the door. I paused. On more thing, Michael, what Anthony did kept my kids from their father for 3 months. I can't forgive that, and I don't think I can keep working here. Please don't make any decisions just yet. Gedleton, see what happens next week. I nodded in agreement and left his office immediately, calling Penny to Leather. No, I was on my way that night after the kids were asleep. I began to wonder what else Tony had interfered with. I pulled out all the legal documents from the past year, and the photos fell out. Seeing them still made messy. I looked again. Something clicked. The tattoo. Richard's tattoo wasn't visible in any of the pictures. It wasn't Richard in those photos. I laid them out, realizing Richard's face was only visible in half of them, always with his eyes close. To check the divorce papers, the ground stated Richard Thompson did commit fidelity with Miss Ava Bellandois, but I had never known her name handled the divorce because I was too upset. Where had the lawyer gotten that name? The next day, I started investigating. I searched for Ava Bellandois and found multiple payments to her, including one for $2,000 from Tony's cost center. I went to speak with Maggie, Tony's secretary. Hi, Kathy, what brings you here? You know, Tony's away, right? Maggie greeted me as I walked into her office. Yes, I know, I replied. I was happy. You could help me with some audit questions. We found payments to a Miss Eva Bellandois. Do you know who she is? Maggie blushed slightly. Yes, unfortunately. She's an escort Mr. Woodward uses to keep certain clients happy. I don't approve. So he handles it directly. Do you have a file on her? I asked. Yeah, I'll grab it for you, she said, heading to a filing cabinet. Maggie returned with a file in hand. She's a beautiful girlie. You think she could find a better way to make a living? She handed Meth the file, then asked hesitantly. Mr. Woodward isn't in any trouble. It's nothing more than usual. Maggie, don't worry. I reassured her. I waited until I got back to my office to open the file. As I reviewed it, Maggie's description was accurate. Eva's strikingly beautiful and intelligent, with a degree from the University of Kiev. The photos in the files showed her in a much better light than those I'd seen during the divorce proceedings. I found her contact information and left their messages. She called me back around midday. Hello, this is Eva Bellandois. You called. Her voice came through the phone. Yes. I'm Kathleen Thompson from Pendleton's Simpson Woodcock. I'd like to discuss something with you. Could we meet for lunch? You work for Mr. Woodward. I already told him I don't work for him anymore. Var responded, sounding I. Retated, no, I don't work for him. This is a different matter. It's work-related but not connected to Woodward. Fine, she said, her tons of tinning slightly. Name a time and place. Roberto at 1:30 p.m. I suggested okay, you pay. C. Eva arrived fashionably late, drawing the attention of everyone in the restaurant. After we shook hands and ordered our meals. She didn't waste any time. What do you want? She asked bluntly. His lit a photo of Richard across the table. Her demeanor shifted immediately. Her cheerful expression vanished and she looked visibly upset. It told him I wouldn't do that. Again, she said sharply, you can't tell him that. Tell who? I asked, confused. I don't work for Woodward. I'm Richard's ex-wife. Eva's eyes widened in surprise as she sat back down, taking a moment to process. Well, this is disappointing. He used to talk about how beautiful his wife was. And you're pretty, but anyway, what do you want? She said, her turning dismissive after our food arrived, and we mostly in silences. She explained, I'm an escort, yes, but I have self-respect. What happened that night made me los. Woodward paid me to hurt your husband. Your husband didn't deserve. Itchy, a good man, he refused to come to my room. He kept talking about his wonderful wife. I had to get him so drunk he could barely stand, then took him to a room. Woodward. Dad booked, he was too drunk to do anything. So Woodward took the photos himself, posing me with your husband. And next that was Woodward. He said someone was going to do for what he paid. He's at the camera on at and did it himself. It took her hand. Nobody deserves that. Eva continued, your husband was kind the next morning. He didn't even remember me. He apologized thinking he never met me before. I explained that Richard used that line with all attractive women, but she understood he genuinely didn't remember her. I helped. Woodward blackmail him, and that makes me feel terrible. I'm glad Richard didn't do what Woodward wanted. I'm sorry, Eva. He's not my husband anymore. We divorced because of those pictures. Eva and I talked for another half hour. She was kind and easy to talk to, and I could see why men would be drawn to her. Afterward, I returned to the office and called Miss Pendleton, who asked for details on the payments to Eva. Concerned here, requested a full review of all the transactions. I called my mother to ask her to take Tom and Maddie for the night. I didn't want them in the house when Tony came home. My mind was racing. The man I thought that betrayed me hadn't, and the one I trusted had been behind all my problems. Is tapped my desk, crying, feeling overwhelmed. Brenda eventually came and listened as I poured out everything, and then started asking questions. Do you love Tony? No, I don't think so. Maybe I never did. I admitted. How do you feel about Richard? She continued. I sighed. I'm ashamed. Eva made him sound like the perfect husband a year ago. You'd have agreed with her. Brenda reminded me. I would have. I said softly. I wish I'd never seen those photos. Well, you divorce. Ed Himley, can anyone would have in your positions, he said, trying to comfort me. You should have listened to him. I replied, regret heavy in my voice. It's easy to say that. Now, Brenda said gently, go home and think about what you're going to do next. I don't have time. I said, shaking my head. Tony's coming back tonight, and I know what I need to do. When I got home, I packed Tony's belongings into 2 large suitcases by 5 p.m. Everything was ready as that with a glass of wine, thinking about how I would tell Richard what I had uncovered. When Tony walked in and saw the suitcases, she looked confused. What's all this? Are we going somewhere? Asked. No. I said calmly, you're moving out. What he said, his voice rising in disbelief. I know about the injunction, Tony. He spoke to Eva. I want you out of my house and out of my life. Let him talk about this, he said, grabbing my shoulders and pushing me toward the dining room. His grip tightened painfully. I'm not leaving. I put too much into this. Tony, you're hurting me, I said, trying to pull away. Oh, now you notice he's near, tightening his hold even more. Sit down, and I'll tell you how it's going to be. As we entered the dining room, it felt a chair behind me. I pushed his hands off me, accidentally scratching his nose and making it bleed. Furious, he swung his hand to slap me, but I caught this wrist, spun him, and threw him to the floor, thanks to the self-defense lessons Richard had insisted. I held Tony's wrist down and pressed my foot against his chest. Why, Tony, what did Richard ever to you? I demanded. Nothing. He spatha had what I want, so I took it. I don't care about me, you just wanted the image. As Ed, my voice cold, exactly, had admitted the business world trusts family men. I'd never make partner as a single guy. As a shortcut, marry you, be family man in a year, you're attractive, the kids are cute. I had a tall. I pressed my heel harder into his ribs. Say one more thing and I'll give your eel heart H'a. Then I knew what I wanted. I let goof his wrist, stood up and picked up the phone. I dialed Richard. Richard, can you come over? I need to talk to you. Now the kids are fine, it's about something else. Oh, Han, bring your riffle. I hung up and looked at Tony. You've got 5 to 10 minutes before he gets here. Do you really want to be here? When I tell him what you did, you think I'm scared of him. You don't know him. You tried to take away the most important thing in his life, his kids. That makes them dangerous. Now get up and pack your things before it's too late. As Tony was leaving, Richard pulled up in his old Volvo, watching the red BMW drive away. I opened the door and hugged him, but I stiffened like I was hugging a stranger. He gently pulled my arms away. We want Kathy. You've already taken everything from me, and since when do I own a rifle? Richard asked, his tone bitter. I paused, realizing how much damage there was to our pair. The man who once loved and trusted, Manau's ulterior motives and everything I did. It's not like that, Richard. I just want to talk and explain, I said, trying to sound calm. He glanced past me, his eyes narrowing. Wasn't that your boyfriend driving off? What is he coming back with the police to arrest me? But there's no injunction and Tony's not coming back. Please just come inside, I pleaded reluctantly. Richard followed me into the living room and sat on the edge of the sofa, clearly ready to bolt at any moment. Can I get you a drink? Offered, trying to ease the tension. Sparkling water or coffee? Please, I don't drink anymore, not since that night when everything fell apart. The said quietly. I made his coffee. Just Anyway, he liked it and handed it to him. Where are you living now? I asked, trying to make small talk with Robat. The scrapyard sleeping in one of the kids' rooms, she replied. They've been great to me, even let me have the old Volvo house work. I asked, though I wasn't sure. I wanted to know. They let me go 6 months ago. I was useless after everything happened, admitted, staring at the floor. I get some contract work. Now you've still been making the payments on time. I noted my kids aren't going to suffer because I messed up, he said firmly, his words cut deep. You're not making this easy. I'd feeling the weight of what I was about to confess. Why should I? He shot back. You threw me out and took everything over one mistake. That's the thing. Richard, you didn't make a mistake, I said softly. He looked at me confused. What do you mean you didn't sleep with her? It was all a setup, she told me. I'm so sorry, I said, my voice breaking. His anger shifted to disbelief. But those photos, some were of you, but the rest were of Tony. I explained. Eva told me everything. She's ashamed of her part net and wants to help. Richard just stared at me, trying to process what I just told him. I went to the kitchen, tears welling up, seeing how much pain Richard was in. Torn me part. I brought him his coffee and sat down with my glass of wine. He took a sip and gave a small smile. You still make great coffee, he said. Then after a pause, head did. Now tell me how Tony set me up. I explained everything, asking him not to call Tony Loverboy because it was never love. Richard listened, calm on the surface, but I could tell he was processing everything quietly, and that worried me. Richard, please don't do anything rash, I pleaded. We need you stay here tonight. You feel better in the morning. He shook his head. I can't stay. I've got a date tonight. Don't worry, I won't do anything stupid. When Richard mentioned a date, it felt like a punch to the stomach. I hadn't considered that he might have moved, even though I had lived with Tony for 6 months. I winced as she stood to leave, feeling the weight of lost time. Desperate, I used the only card I had left. The kids are eager to see you. Could you come by tomorrow? I asked. Really, you'd be okay with that? Asked, his surprise evident. Of course, I replied. You can pick them up from Mom's tomorrow, and I'll stay there until Sunday night. You can have time with them here, or take them out. Tears wetting. Easy SS, I handed him the house keys. Are you sure? Asked, his voices off. They're your children, too. You should see them whenever you want. Asha left, turned and said, thanks, Kath. I'll be here around 1. I've got something in the morning. Later, I called Mom to explain what had happened. She wasn't surprised. She'd never liked Tony, always calling him a creepy little man, and she'd believed from the start that I should have given Richard another chance. In her mind, you stood by your man. She still called Richard her son-in-law, and was thrilled at the thought of seeing him again. Richard arrived at 1:30 the next day, and Mom insisted we'll have lunch together. It was the first time in over a year we had sat down as a family, and she loved every minute of it. As Richard left with the kids, she kissed him on the cheek and told him to come back soon after they left. Mom turned to me. So what's your plan now? I sighed, feeling overwhelmed. I don't know, Mom, it's all such a mess. Do you think you can rebuild your life with them? He still loves you? I'm not sure. I admitted. He's so hurt and angry. He'll calm down, she said confidently, especially now that they can see the kids. That was a smart move. I'll try, I said, unsure, but I'm going to need help. Mom nodded, her voice firm. Then start eating humble pie and building alliances. She was right. I wanted Richard back. I'd have to start with his family. The weekend went well. Mom and I grew closer, united in purpose. I returned home Sunday evening, just in time to help Richard put the kids to bed. They were happy and full of stories about their time with him afterward. I offered Richard sparkling water and suggested he pick the kids up from school. Sometimes we parted on good terms, giving me hope. Monday arrived too quickly, and I was nervous about facing Tony. I had my resignation letter ready, but decided to honor my commitment to Michael Pendleton. I watched Tony arrive looking confident, while I failed to notice a white truck parking next to his BMW. Tony, fresh from a successful trip, was in high spirits. His secretary greeted him warmly as she headed to his office. Miss Pendleton wants to see you right away, she said. Tony dropped off his briefcase and made his way to the top floor. He walked into Michael Pendleton's office, ready to share his success before he could speak. Michael pulled out a file and said, I'm glad to hear about the new client, Anthony, but that's not why I called you. It seems you've been up to some mischief using the firm's name. Tony looked confused. I'm sorry, Michael, I don't understand. Do you deny pressuring Devin Tranton to filing an injunction against Richard Thompson? Anthony began to feel uneasy. Yes, I did request the injunction, but it was urgent. He was threatening Kathy and me. We needed protections. So you deny submitting false evidence for that injunction? Yes, of course. Then can you provide the original statement signed by Mrs. Thompson? She denies making one and claims the allegations are false. You on? I provided a copy, so where's the original? Damn, Anthony muttered, standing abruptly. I noticed the 2 security guards who had quietly the office. From that reaction, I assume it's true. Michael said coldly, please sit down, we're not finished. Anthony knew his career at Pendleton, Sims and Woodcock was over now. We wondered how bad it would get next. There are some accounting issues. We have records of payments to Miss Eva Bolowa, all signed by you. You've listed these expenses as entertainment. What exactly was she doing for us, Anthony? He citated, shifting uncomfortably. Michael, sometimes keeping clients happy means doing things we're not proud of. Michael leaned back, his expression cold. So which client did she entertain when you paid her double? I'd have to check my records. Anthony replied, avoiding eye contact. Miss Binka says you used her to blackmail a client. Michael pressed, that's not true. He wasn't a client. Anthony shot back defensively. Michael raised his hand, cutting him off. I've heard enough. We're handing everything over to the police. You'll likely face charges and the Law Society may revoke your license. The SEG. Entleman will escort you to your office. You have 1 hour to collect your things. Anthony left the building, his confidence drained as darkened further when he spotted Richards standing by his parking space, a box of Anthony's belongings at his feet. As Anthony approached, Richard set the box down and glared at them. Too late, tack tough. Richard, move, Anthony snapped. Richard gestured toward the parking space, revealing a red metal cube, a crushed car. Anthony's eyes widened as she recognized the remnants of his BMW, the badges still attached. Furious, he swung at Rich. Artist's fist barely grazing him, Richard retaliated, swiftly kicking Anthony between the legs and driving his knee into Anthony's face, knocking him to the ground. Anthony, do anything that will get you in trouble. We can't lose you again. Richard reassured me, don't worry, I'm taking him down, but my kids won't be visiting me in prison that night. Tony's car disappeared from the company lot. The police found it the next day, burned out in the woods. Richard sued Tony for damages, including child support, reputation damage, and damage to our marriage, valuing it at £200,000. He was determined to destroy Tony, but I just wanted it all to be over. Richard and Rob couldn't stop laughing as they worked on the red BMW. Rob explained how they're programmed a blank key to steal the car and removed its identifying marks. They used parts from a wrecked cart, swapped the ID numbers, ensuring the car would be untraceable. Richard asked, can he prove it's his car? Not a chance. Rob said the burnout car was crushed. Your new ride is squeaky clean. Richard then mentioned he owns out on bail. Now think he'll get off? Not with Eva testifying, Rob replied. Richard was intrigued by Eva, surprised by how nice she turned out to be. Despite her job with immunity, she agreed to testify, further sealing Tony's fate. Richard's mild no. Inga now had the upper hand as they finished. Richard said, I hope he goes crazy when he sees me with his car, maybe even attacks me so I can get them arrested again. Rob chuckled, and he called you a chicken. You fight the battles you can win, Robin, right now. I've got all the big weapons on my side. As they walked back to the bungalow, Richard thought about what his brother had said. So when did you talk to Kath? I didn't, but she's been talking to Vicky. They're getting close again. You're right. You need to figure things out with her, but first, you need to deal with him. 2 weeks after Tony's arrest, Richard arrived at school in a new car. Maddie immediately noticed. Daddy, why are you driving Uncle Tony's carrot? It's not Uncle Tony's car, sweetheart. It just looks like it. It's identical, she insisted. I couldn't help but ask, where did you get the money for this? I bought it from Rob. It's an insurance write-off, only cost me £1,000. And I got 200 for the Volvo. Don't worry, I've got it covered, he said with a grin that suggested there was more to the story since getting the car. Richard drove everywhere, which didn't go noticed by friends who comment on its resemblance to Tony's. For me, it was a constant reminder of what Tony had done to us. Richard was still living with Robin Vicky and refused my offers to stay over to make things shorter. He was dating. He said it was nothing serious, but it worried me. He was single, and anything could happen. I hoped his tattoo would scare off potential love interests, though I knew that was wishful thinking every day. I regretted my mistakes. Watching Richard with the kids, seeing the love he had for them, reminded me of how he used to love me as the trials approached. I hoped that once it was over, we could rebuild our life together. Richard attended the trials, the first involving misappropriation of funds. Eva Bolowa was the key witness, explaining how Anthony had paid her to seduce Richard under the guise of business. She cried as she revealed she had been misled, portraying herself as an innocent Ukrainian woman, manipulated by Anthony. As she left the stand, she smiled at Richard that evening. Eva waited for Richard and invited him to dinner. He was impressed by her intelligence and beauty, understanding why she commanded high fees. As they ate, Richard noticed the envious glances from other men in the restaurant when the coffee arrived. Eva reached across the table and placed her hand gently on Richard's. Would you like to come home with me tonight? She asked softly. Richard, taken aback, replied, you don't owe me anything. I know, Eva said, her voice is sincere. I'm not offering out of obligation. I want to. I've been with many men, but tonight, I want to be with you. You're a good man, and I think it will be good for both of us. When the bill came, Eva insisted on paying, us in her dinner card. They took a cab to her flat. Once there, Richard stood by the window gazing out across the river, while Eva poured drinks. Are you sure you just want water? She asked, raising an eyebrow. The only thing I'm You're off right now, Richard replied, his voice is steady. Eva handed him a glass, then looped her arm around his and kissed him softly. Now you're sober, there are no cameras, and you're a free man, let you enjoy yourselves, yes. Richard smiled faintly. Oh, yes, she said, pulling her closer. Shelled him to the bedroom. They made love, and afterward as they lay together, insolent. Richard remained lost in thought, sensing his unease. Ava kissed him gently, as if answering the unspoken question on his mind. Thank you, darling, that was wonderful, she said softly. Richard smiled. Riley, I bet you say that. To all the guys to clients, yes, because they pay to hear it, Eva admitted. But I mean it with you, most men just take what they want. You make love to me, and that makes me feel special. Kathy's a lucky woman, not anymore. We're divorced, remember? Richard said, his voice heavy with emotion. Eva smiled knowingly. You go back to her aunts, the anger fades. No, Richard looked at her surprised. How can you be so sure? Is this your way of saying you don't want to see me again? No, I enjoy being with you. Ari assured him, but I won't give up my work. You wouldn't be okay with that. Richard was silent. For a moment, then Av added, and besides, you're still in love with her. That's why I thirst so much. What makes you think she wants me back? Richard asked, doubt creeping into his voice as she Dova said confidently, trust me. Richard exhaled. So what now? Az with a smile. We shower and sleep tomorrow. We make love again before court the next day. In court, Anthony pleaded guilty and asked for leniency. His lawyer argued that his legal career was over and he offered to repay the stolen funds. The judge gave him a 3-year sentence, suspended for 5. Richard was furious. Expecting a harsher punishment, he left the courtroom to cool off, and when Anthony walked by smiling, Richard wanted to react, but Feva's calming hand, one lawyer won't punish another, sure minded him. He thought that goddamn a mom gets jail for stealing milk, and he walks after stealing thousands. Richard fumed. Eva reassured him that the blackmail charge was still pending, which helped calm him down. Richard didn't visit the kids for 2 days, clearly upset. I called Vicky and she said he hadn't returned home right after court. I worried until I got a text, don't worry. He's back. It took another day for Richard to visit the kids. They greeted him like he'd been gone 4 months that night. He told me about the trial, but I couldn't match his anger. I just wanted to move forward and leave Tony behind. Vicky and Rob discussed Richard staying with them longer than expected. Rob suggested him back into her house, but Richard wasn't sure. Vicky jumped in, urging him to give it a chance, reminding him I was the one who exposed Tony and helped take him down. Richard wasn't convinced, still feeling hurt over the past, but she slept with the man who set me up, argued. Vicky calmly pointed out that I kicked Tony out as soon as I learned the truth and tried to fix things, shaving Richard around wash helpful. He often picked up the kids and stayed for dinner, but there was still distance between us. When he mentioned needing to find a place to live, I suggested him move in with us, reminding him he was already paying the mortgage. Eventually agreed after moving back. Things didn't progress. As I'd hoped, 4 weeks in, Westall weren't sharing a bed, and he continued going out a few nights a week to not coming home until the next day. I knew someone else was still in his life. We grew closer as a family, in some ways spending weekends together and attending the kids' school events from the outside. We probably looked like a normal family. My friend Penny even asked if we were planning to remarry. I broke down, telling her we slept in separate rooms, and I suspected he had a girlfriend. Things worsened when Maddie, upset about sharing her room, innocently asked, why can't Daddy sleep in your bed? Her childlike logic hit hard, especially when she pointed out you weren't married to Tony but had slept in your bed. The silence was crushing. Richard overheard, stood up, grabbed his coat, and left, saying, I'm going for a walk. Maddie star. Ted crying, asking if Daddy would come back. I assured her he would, and he did return later to tuck the kids in, though he went straight to his room afterward. That moment set us back when the blackmail charge against Tony was dropped. I feared it would break Richard, but I was somewhat relieved. You wouldn't have to lean court, something I knew we couldn't do. I tried to console Richard after the blackmail charge was dropped. We could sue him in civil court and take whatever money he has, I suggested. But that wasn't enough for Richard. He wanted Anthony in prison to lift this Ritz suggested taking the kids swimming that weekend. Penny and her kids joined, displaying with the children seemed to cheer him. And he even started teaching Maddie how to swim. Penny kept staring at Richard and nudged her. Hey, that's my husband you're ogling, Shalaf. Don't you mean ex-husband? I'm working on that. Ized with a grin. You better hurry on. He ends back to himself. There's gonna be a line, she teased, watching him swim. I realized she was right. He looked great, and I noticed some women watching him too. He turned to Penny and said, I'm going to fix him, and when I do, he'll be all mine. Penny chuckled. Good luck with that. What's your secret weapon on those two? Ized, pointing to Maddie and Tom. He won't go far as long as I've got them, and I'll make sure he never wants to after swimming. Richard suggested we'll got a Pizza Hut. It was a perfect end to the day. As we walked out of the mall, he held my hand, and I felt a spark of hope. Until Isa Tony, he smirked at us. Well, looks like my cast-offs found someone to take care of them. Richard calmly replied, as I recall she threw you out. Tony sneered, all the charges are dropped. You really thought you could take me down. Richard guided the kids away, but Tony followed, taunting him. What now, big man, going to roll over like always? Richard turned to Penny. Can you take the kids home, please? Penny quickly bundled the children into her car, sensing trouble. Richard and I headed toward the BMW, but Tony ran after us, shouting, that's my car, you stole it. Before Richard could react, Tony punched him, knocking him to the ground. He kicked Richard while he was down, and I dealed the police, trying to pony away, but his shove met to the ground. Richard winked at Methan. With a swift move, struck Tony in the groin, sending him reeling. Richard followed up, punching Tony's jaw, pinning him to the ground. I think you just evaded your suspended sentence, Richard said coldly. It's your word against mine. Tony groaned. Richard nodded toward a CCTV camera. Big Brother's watching. That camera's caught everything. As the police arrived, they pulled Richard off Tony. Paramedics treated both men. Richard had broken ribs and Tony had a broken jaw. Richard and I rode in the ambulance together. Despite his pain, he's mild. He's going down, Kath. We won't see him for a few years. Is mild through tears. I just wish the card'd remind me of him, then they will get it repainted, he said, squeezing my hand. Couldn't hold LD back anymore and cried, I'm so sorry. Richard, this is all my fault. No, it's his fault, and now he's going to pay. Richard was right, had broken ribs and liver damage, but after 2 days in the hospital he came home. Tony, with his jaw wired shut, was taken into police custody. Rob collected the BMW, and a week later the police came to inspect Tony's claims. After checking the documents, they said we had nothing to worry about. He insisted Richard used the master bedroom, slept beside him for the first few nights to make sure he was okay, though we only slept waking up next. To like heaven, after 2 weeks she moved back to his own room, and while we were closer it wasn't quite what I had hoped. Unfortunately, once he was well, Richard went out again and didn't return until the next day. Eva called a couple of times while he was recovering, worried about him. Once he was better they met up, but Richard sensed something was wrong. At their flat, Hest, what's bothering you? Evie, it's not you, she said with a sad smile. It's me. I like you too much, Richard, but you have your children and I know you can't leave them. I can't keep doing this. You deserve better. They spent the night together knowing it would be their last. The next morning they parted on good terms. But Richard was quieter when he came home. He didn't talk much about it, and I didn't push him. Over the following weeks it seemed like he had broken things off. For good, he wasn't going out as much anymore. It took a month for Richard to fully recover, but he never stopped playing with the kids. By the time Tony's trial came up, we were getting along much better. We were both called as witnesses along with Penny before the trial. Prosecution warned us Tony might claim provocation, though the CCTV footage was clear. Penny was a star witness, calmly recounting how Richard had asked her to take the children away to avoid a fight. When the defense asked why, Penny replied it was obvious. Mr. Woodward was itching for a fight. Mr. Thompson didn't want his kids to see him getting hurt. Their answer was simple and honest, and I could almost see the jurors marking Richard as a good dad and family man. The judges sentenced Tony to 10 years plus 3 more from his suspended sentence. He might be out in Sears with good behavior, but for now Richard felt relieved. The civil case for damages was still pending. But with Tony in prison, Richard was much happier. Tony's accounts were frozen until the case was settled, and during this time, Richard and I grew closer. Though we still hadn't rekindled our physical relationship, we shared our thoughts and dreams. But the unresolved tension was frustrating. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I quietly slipped into Richard's bed and kissed him. He responded, and we made love just like I'd longed for. But afterward, he gently told me I needed to go back to my room, saying it would confuse the kids if they found us together. His rejection stung, and I cried myself to sleep. It took a week for to feel normal between us again. Our relationship improved slowly, with moments of closeness followed by Richard retreating to his own space. I knew I had to make a bold move. In February 2012, I prepared his favorite dinner, put champagne on ice, and after the kids were in bed, I put on a white silk kimono. I knelt in front of him, holding his hand. Richard Thompson, will you marry me? I asked, my voice trembling. He was surprised, but eventually slid my old engagement ring onto my finger. I was overjoyed and pulled out the champagne. He teased me. We both knew it was a turning point. He carried me upstairs, and that night felt like a fresh start. The next morning, Maddie saw us together and asked, Mommy, are you and Daddy married now? Not yet, but soon, I replied, and she eagerly asked to be a bridesmaid. Moments later, Tom joined us in bed. It was a perfect family moment, but I knew we still had work to do for the next 6 months. We both went to counseling to deal with our issues. Richard needed to release his anger, and I had to forgive myself. Finally, last August, we got married with Maddie as our bridesmaid. During the civil case, Tony's solicitor offered us 2 rental properties as a settlement. and Richard agreed on the condition that they also covered our legal costs. Richard mostly stuck to his no-boozer rule, occasionally having just one drink. His contract work grew, and his old company even offered him his job. Back had declined, pointing out that his contractor rate was much higher, and now he's employed at a higher level than his former boss. When winning back Richard's family has been challenging, but as they see how happy, they're starting to forgive me. I'm hopeful this time we'll make it for good.